Welcome to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're discussing loneliness. Christopher J. Ferguson looks into research surrounding, although Americans are increasingly alone, are they really lonely? In 2023, the former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released a report saying we are in the midst of a loneliness epidemic, saying that perhaps half of Americans face a personal crisis of loneliness that poses similar health risks to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. These claims do resonate with declining marriage and birth rates, as well as work from home increases, but are largely unsupported and show a misreading of data. The academic whose study was used in Murthy's Epidemic report even says she wasn't measuring loneliness, but instead declines in social connection. Data shows that social engagement has dropped only about 1.7% since 2003, hardly an epidemic. Critics argue real issues that exist are being amplified by being attributed to science that doesn't show causation. Loneliness is difficult to track, which may be why so many shifted to time spent alone. Scientists aren't arguing that loneliness isn't a bad thing and can be associated with declining health, but they say we must look at breakdowns in institutions and understand the nuance behind things. Maybe people are more lonely, or maybe how we interact with one another has changed. I'm joined now by the lead investigator on the story, Christopher J. Ferguson. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me on today. I always appreciate it.
So the article pushes back on former U.S. Surgeon General Murthy's claim that the U.S. is facing a loneliness epidemic. Can you explain the importance of differentiating between time alone and loneliness?
Yeah, this seems to be a very common shift in the argument that people will start talking about this idea that we're lonelier than we have been in past years. But then they'll shift to talking about, well, that's because we're spending less time with other people. You know, we're in church less, or people are getting married less, or people are spending time in social clubs less. And that's actually a little bit of a different thing. So what we actually seem to be seeing is that there's a very small decline, really, in time spent with other individuals. And that's a decline of about 1.7% over the last 20 years or so. So it's not a big decline. But there does appear to be, some decline in time spent with others. But that doesn't mean that we feel alone necessarily, because sometimes other people are annoying. I mean, it's not always good, when we're with other individuals. So that was kind of what we were trying to look at, is trying to understand, does this seem to translate into an increase in people feeling sad, specifically, that they're not with other people? Are they feeling lonely, basically? And actually, the evidence there is much weaker. There doesn't seem to be clear evidence that there's actually been a decline in people's feelings of, connection with others, or an increase in people's feelings of loneliness. So I think we have to be a little bit more careful than we've been in distinguishing between time spent alone, which may be increasing, versus actually feeling sad about that.
And I mean, when he was releasing his report, he was saying that comparing it to smoking 15 cigarettes, is that just taking it way too far and kind of overstating the issue? Is he not addressing the fact that quality of contact can really play into the effect of if you do feel loneliness, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it was a bit of an odd comparison. He's actually comparing loneliness in terms of mortality. So he's really kind of arguing that loneliness leads to death, in a way comparable to between 1 to 15 cigarettes, which is defined basically as light smoking. Now, why didn't they compare it to moderate smoking or heavy smoking, which, in that case, obviously the smoking would come out much worse than the loneliness. I think it's probably why they didn't make that comparison. But I think it's a little bit risky in that it seems to kind of de-emphasize the impact of smoking in some ways, which may give the wrong message, because I don't know that the average person would know what 15 cigarettes is. Or that's a non-smoker. I didn't even know if that's is that moderate? Is it heavy? Is it light? But yeah, I mean, I think it's also with smoking, we know it kills through lung cancer and through heart attacks. There are direct mechanisms that it kills through. With loneliness, it's not really clear that there's a direct causal mechanism. It could be that people who are sicker, that they just can't make social connections as well, or in tragic cases may even be abandoned by family members and such. And so the causal direction may be in the opposite, it may be in the opposite direction, essentially. So I think he was making kind of this causal argument that really was dangerous, really wasn't supported in the actual data that was available, if he had used heavy smoking, the numbers would have been very different. And I think it risks perhaps actually minimizing the impact of smoking on people.
I feel like your pieces tend to emphasize the fact that sometimes correlations are being drawn, like it's correlation versus causation, right? Like people are making leaps that might be not correct in what they're trying to do. And your article kind of calls for nuance, that we need to find a middle ground between saying something is an epidemic, excuse me, versus not speaking at all about it. How do we find that nuance?
I think it's very tricky. I mean, I think there's kind of this normal human cognitive bias in a way, really, that kind of it makes things in dichotomies. Either something's valueless or unimportant, or it's a crisis, And we really seem to have struggle, talking about things that are in the middle. So I think my argument here is like, yes, there's some evidence that time spent alone is increasing. Maybe there are some things like decreasing marriage rates or that we should be a little bit worried about, but it doesn't seem to be a crisis. And I really feel like there's just so many crises people are being scared about all the time, and I think that itself can become stressful over time. If everything's a crisis, then people start to think the world is a lot worse than it is. But I think it's ultimately it's going to be the consumer that has to make some choices, become better at critical thinking, essentially. So be aware that people are trying to sell us crises all the time. And I mean, it is profitable to scare people, to sell books, speaking engagements, get grants, all kinds of other stuff, newspapers, of course. And I think we have to be more alert about that and be a bit more conscientious in pushing back against some of the crisis mentality. Not in saying that it doesn't mean it's not a real issue, but stop telling us everything's an emergency. We just want to know the nuances, the facts. And if we, reward newspapers and policymakers for doing that, then they'll do more of that. So I think it's really about the attention economy and what we decide to give attention to. And if we decide not to give attention to things that are, exaggerated crises, then we'll probably see less of them over time.
So instead of saying that we are in a loneliness epidemic, how do we reframe that conversation correctly to actually address what we are really seeing?
Right. Okay, well, I think what we're really seeing is a modest decline in some social connections that isn't necessarily translating into big mental health issues necessarily. People don't seem to necessarily be more distressed about these things than they were in the past. But in some cases, such as like with declining marriage rates, maybe that is something we should think about. Are there advantages, for instance, to kids, coming from, intact marriages as opposed to single parent homes, for instance? So I think some of that can be reframed as saying like, yes, there are a few things here that we may want to think about that are very specific. And at the same time say, but at the same point, we can think about these things, we can work about these things, but we can do so rationally. And we'll probably be able to fix these, small problems better if we're not panicking. And if we're panicking, we're probably going to make much worse decisions about how to fix these things than if we actually approach it much more carefully.
And I mean, some people do like working home alone, and they're not feeling lonely being
Yeah.
at their house. They're feeling like this is the best thing for them. Any other key takeaways you'd like to leave people with?
I mean, there's been a there really has been a big incline in working from home, after the pandemic, which kind of normalized that for a lot of people. And I don't think most people want to go back to that. I mean, I actually myself, teach twice a week. So I drive into my university twice a week to teach, and I mostly work from home. And that's great because less car accidents, less gas. It's a 45-minute commute for me. So there's a lot of benefits, to that. So I wouldn't want to change it. And there's also the other thing that's nuance in this is when we talk about time spent alone or with other people, they're not including things like that. So if I'm playing a video game with friends all over the country online, that's still considered alone time, in a lot of these analyses. And it's not really clear that that should be. So a lot of this may be just a shift in the way that we're spending time with other people, including into digital environments. Not necessarily that we're hanging out by ourselves, sad in a darkened room, which I think is what people are imagining.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.